Wilmington is now looking at buying the tallest building in the city, the Thermo Fisher Building, better known as the old PPD building. It comes after the city announced the purchase of the Salvation Army property on 2nd Street, and last year it bought the United Bank building across from City Hall. WECT's Michael Pratt caught up with State Treasurer Dale Folwell, who also heads up the Local Government Commission, to get his thoughts on the city's acquisitions.
$11 million for the old Crestcom Bank building in downtown Wilmington. $5 million for the property of the Salvation Army. That's how much the city of Wilmington has spent over the past year acquiring properties. Now, City Council is considering a $68 million purchase of the former PPD building right behind me.
The announcement of the proposed purchase of the Thermo Fisher Building is the latest property the city might add to its portfolio. City Council will vote next week to consider putting down $500,000 for a deposit while staff does their due diligence. We're told the purchase could be a way to consolidate city workers from 8 buildings into one. Mayor Bill Saffo says $68 million is a good deal considering the tax value on the property is more than $140 million. The desire to have all city offices under one roof logistically makes sense, and buying the property would also include the 1,000-space parking garage. State Treasurer Dale Folwell says it's not up to his office or the Local Government Commission to determine the need for the purchase, but he believes when governments start buying up so much property, there's less opportunity for businesses to grow, and that could have an impact on everyone.
And oftentimes when you have cities and governmental entities that take over so much private commercial real estate, there's less tax revenue. Therefore, the cost of essential services has to be spread among fewer and fewer people.
Obviously, this plan is still in its infancy. City Council hasn't made any decisions yet, but I'm told that if they do move forward with the purchase, they would end up selling some of the properties that they already own to fund this purchase. But whether or not the city would actually give up prime pieces of real estate is yet to be seen. In Wilmington, Michael Pratt, WECT News.